By Jeffrey Goldberg pulls back the curtain on Chairman Mark Milley's tireless efforts to counter an unstable president, Donald Trump, who was intent on swinging a wrecking ball into the pillars of our democracy. We'll get to that meeting between President Joe Biden and President Zelensky at the White House in a minute, but we begin with that brand new reporting on Milley's efforts to what can only be described as protecting the U.S. military and the country from Donald Trump. The Atlantic reports that Trump's disregard for the rules of the military were clear from the very start of Milley's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. From that piece, quote, at his welcome ceremony at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, across the Potomac River from the Capitol, Milley gained an early and disturbing insight into Trump's attitude towards soldiers. Milley had chosen a severely wounded Army captain, Luis Avila, to sing God Bless America. Avila, who had completed 5 combat tours, had lost a leg in an IED attack in Afghanistan, and had suffered 2 heart attacks, 2 strokes, and brain damage as a result of his injuries. To Milley and to 4-star generals across the Army, Avila and his wife Claudia represented the heroism, the sacrifice, and the dignity of wounded soldiers. After Avila's performance, Trump walked over to congratulate him, but then said to Milley within earshot of several witnesses, quote, why do you bring people like that here? Nobody wants to see that, the wounded. Never let Avila appear in public again, Trump told Milley. And that was day 1 on the job for Milley. The rest of his tenure under Donald Trump entailed trying to curb the worst instincts and excesses of Trump and his allies. As the Atlantic reports, 20 men have served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs since the position was created after World War II, until Milley then had been forced to confront the possibility that a president would try to foment or provoke a coup in order to illegally remain in office. A plain reading of the record shows that in the chaotic period before and after the 2020 election, Milley did as much as, or more than any other American, to defend the constitutional order, to prevent the military from being deployed against the American people, and to forestall the eruption of wars within America's nuclear-armed adversaries. His defense of the constitutional order, as the Atlantic puts it, entailed being on high alert for any moves made by Trump and his coup-plotting allies. From that new reporting, quote, shortly after Defense Secretary Mark Esper was fired, Milley told both Kash Patel and Ezra Cohen-Watnick, another Trump loyalist sent to the Pentagon, that he would make sure they would see the world from behind bars if they did anything illegal to prevent Joe Biden from taking the oath of office on January 20th. Both men have denied being warned in this manner. When the plot to overturn the 2020 election erupted into violence on January 6, Milley played a critical role in the response. In his testimony to the January 6 Select Committee, Milley underscored Trump's dereliction of duty. Watch.
Yeah, being the commander-in-chief, you got an assault going on the capital of the United States of America. And it's nothing. No call, nothing,
Zero. And in the tense period after the insurrection, as concerns about the country's stability spiked here at home and abroad, Milley, according to this new reporting in the Atlantic, quote, gathered the Pentagon's top nuclear officers for an emergency meeting. According to meeting participants, Milley said, quote, if anything weird or crazy happens, just make sure we all know. Milley then went to each officer in turn and asked if he understood the procedures. They all affirmed that they did. Milley told other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, quote, all we've got to do is see to it that the plane lands on January 20th, when the constitutional transfer of power to the new president would be completed. Extraordinary new reporting on the unprecedented efforts of the nation's top military officer to protect the stability of our democracy in the face of a threat posed by its own president is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Retired 4-star general and MSNBC military analyst Barry McCaffrey is here. Editor-at-large for The Bulwark and MSNBC contributor Charlie Sykes is here. And the former lead investigator for the January 6 Select Committee, Tim Hafey's here. General McCaffrey, there have been some reporting, I think, over the years about Trump's disregard for men and women who had served. I mean, I think he rose to prominence in the Republican Party after he said about John McCain, I like soldiers who weren't captured. He would go on to disparage George H.W. Bush and others But to hear that he told the military, the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to, quote, never have the wounded here again, feels like a physical assault against the best of our country, the people who love it so much that they fight to protect it. How do you feel?
Well, I think it's really heartbreaking. It's a tragic situation to read this kind of well-resourced, incredible accounting on what was going on, much of which, by the way, I was aware of at the time. We had 60,000 killed and wounded protecting the American people following 9/11. Wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, special operations missions around the world. It was a giant loss. The armed forces were totally committed to include the National Guard and Reserves. And so to have a president with this, first of all, an ignorant man of the first order, a lawless man who was unaware of the Constitution, thought he could do anything he basically wanted to. And at the time, I was reporting on this network. So when they put an acting Secretary of Defense, a retired lieutenant colonel, and a gang of his coterie into the Department of Defense, I said, this guy is setting up a coup against the United States. That's what you'd have to conclude if it was a third world country. So we were vulnerable to having a president in office with immense authority who has truly lacked any character.
There's something so grotesque about the human character, Charlie, of someone who says, quote, why do you bring people like that here? No one wants to see the wounded. Never let Avila appear in public again, Trump told Milley. I remember when Trump wanted a North Korean-style military parade. I remember some reporting that alluded to the fact that he didn't want to honor wounded veterans as part of that. And I remember picking up other deep alarm that came out of some of the reporting around Mattis's tenure at the Pentagon and Kelly's tenure at the White House. But I'd never seen it sort of on the record in black and white directed at one American hero who's bestowed this honor of performing at Chairman Milley's ceremony. And I believe the chairman's wife works with veterans who come back with injuries visible and not visible. I mean, this is part of the ethos of Chairman Milley and of his family and of the vast majority of the military, to be so anti-military, to be so anti-service, to be so unpatriotic. I find it sick that we have to sit around and talk about him and describe him as the Republican frontrunner day after day after day, Charlie.
Well, you used the right word. It is grotesque, and I've been thinking about this all day. I mean, there's a lot of important things in this article, including, the concerns about starting a nuclear war, a coup. But this particular story is haunting because it reflects something unique about Donald Trump. In the before times, I used to regularly accompany veterans of World War II in Korea and Vietnam from the Midwest to see their memorials in Washington, D.C., part of the honor flight. And just to be around these guys was such an honor. And many of them were in very, very tough shape. But these were the badges of their sacrifice. And literally, I was thinking about this today. And Nicole, I don't know anyone. I don't know that I've ever met anyone who would react the way Donald Trump would react, who would look at someone who has made this sacrifice fighting for their country and say, yeah, I don't want to look at that person anymore. That's embarrassing. Don't let them appear in public. That somehow Donald Trump wants to wrap himself in the flag of support for the military, but he doesn't want to see the cost to the men and women who actually go out there and fight and obey the orders of the commander-in-chief. And, maybe I just haven't gotten around enough to meet more people like this. But this is so consistent for Donald Trump. And he knows that he's gotten away with it. I mean, you mentioned all these specific priors. What he said about John McCain, that he likes people who were not prisoners of war. I thought that would be disqualifying. When he suggested to aides that he didn't want wounded veterans in parades, you would think that veterans groups would be appalled by this. But one last comment on all of this. That if the listeners, the viewers, if you know somebody out there in the world who is Trump curious or adjacent, or who somehow believes that Donald Trump is a genuine patriot, if there's any way that you could tell them this story, tell them the story of Captain Avila, just have them read it and then say, what do you think about that? What do you think about a man who thinks this way? I know that nothing seems to matter to so many people in the base, but this is one of those stories that is so grotesque and so revealing that I would like to see people challenged to reconcile that with supporting putting this man back in the Oval Office.
Tim Hageby, there's some extraordinary reporting in here that also, I think, maybe shines a brighter light on how much anxiety there was inside the military and former military about January 6th, which I don't think was really on the media radar until closer to Election Day. Let me read you more from this piece. General Milley visited General Pete Corelli in Washington State and over breakfast described what he thought was coming next. Quote, "It was unbelievable. This is August 2nd, and he laid out in specific detail what his concerns were between August and Inauguration Day. He identified one of his biggest concerns as January 6th, the day the Senate was to meet to certify the election. It was almost like a crystal ball. Corelli said that Milley told him it was possible, based on his observations of the president and his advisors, that they would not accept an election day loss." I mean, you've done the body of reporting that slides, you know, the evidence on paper back to this Tom Fitton email that's circulating in July. So certainly by August, it's not surprising that it's on their radar. But did we appreciate, or what do you make of how early it was on the radar of the top military officials that Trump may not leave if he loses?
Yeah, I think it was on their minds very early, Nicole. The military had its own intelligence gathering apparatus, and they were monitoring open source information that suggested that this excitement was building about January 6th, and there might be violence, and the president's own public statements challenging the election. He had a lot of conflicting incentives that day. I mean, a lot of the piece, the Atlantic piece, which is so well done, talks about Milley's very strong desire to ensure that the military stays out of anything election related, right? The military cannot be involved in politics, can't be involved in elections. January 6th was a proceeding to certify the election. So there's some reluctance to have the military in advance really visible, because it might seem as if the military was somehow involved in elections. He was always also very concerned about the invocation of the Insurrection Act. Going back to the summer of 2020, President repeatedly would bring up, why don't we put domestic troops out on the streets of Washington, D.C. or other cities where there's domestic unrest? Milley, Esper, others pushed back against that, and they were concerned about the invocation of the Insurrection Act. At the same time, they're seeing this intelligence and this danger, and really stoked by the president, who may very well refuse to leave office. So he and other military leaders in the days leading up to January 6th are balancing a lot of really vexing and difficult conflicting factors. I think they did a good job of it, and they were correct to put their finger on a lot of those dangers.
General McCaffrey, they had, I mean, we've overused words like unprecedented, but they're in this unprecedented situation where the top of their chain of command is someone who there's a growing concern is going to ask them to do something unconstitutional and illegal. So the top of the chain of command becomes the Constitution itself. And I want to share with you some new reporting, again, about something that was widely reported, but we didn't have Chairman Milley's voice on it or his conversations with Trump on the record. So they're on the record for the very first time. Let me read this to you from The Atlantic. Quote, "In November 2019, Trump decided to intervene in 3 different cases that had been working their way through the military justice system. In the most infamous case, the Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher had been found guilty of posing with the corpse of an Islamic State prisoner. Though Gallagher was found not guilty of murder, witnesses testified that he'd stabbed the prisoner in the neck with a hunting knife. In an extraordinary move, Trump reversed the Navy's decision to demote him in rank. Late one night on Air Force One, Milley tried to convince Trump that his intrusion was damaging Navy morale. Trump called Gallagher a hero and said he didn't understand why he was being punished. Quote, because he slit the throat of a wounded prisoner, Milley said. Quote, the guy was going to die anyway, Trump said. Milley answered, quote, Mr. President, we have military ethics and laws about what happens in battle. We can't do that kind of thing. It's a war crime. Trump answered that he didn't understand the big deal. He went on, quote, "You guys," meaning combat soldiers, "are all just killers. What's the difference?" End quote. Again, General McCaffrey, I have no words, but I'm eager to hear yours.
Well, one thing the country needs to understand clearly that under the Constitution, and people are actually unaware that certainly Trump is, there's only two people who can give a lawful order to the armed forces. They're both civilians. One's a commander-in-chief, the president in that function, and the other is the Secretary of Defense. The chairman of the JCS has zero command authority, nor do the service chiefs. They're advisors to the president, the vice president, the National Security Council. So when we end up with a president like Trump, who essentially is a mafia-like figure in his understanding of the use of military power, or for that matter, domestic law enforcement, who lacks character, who is installed in office an acting Secretary of Defense, and his gang of cohorts, who he has reason to believe will follow his orders, then we're in enormous peril. That's what we're seeing again out of this brilliantly sourced article. Mr. Trump, we have no defense against a president with this lack of character, and we were in enormous national peril.
Charlie, and once again, is this anecdote that if you want someone to read one set of facts, and I think a lot of this Trump said in stump speeches at the time. I went back and looked at some of the coverage, and a lot of what he's saying here, he was saying publicly. But this belief that everyone in the military are, quote, all killers, and what's the difference? And Chairman Milley having to explain what a war crime was to a sitting American president is really grotesque.
Yeah, and this is not a secret for Donald Trump. I mean, he has expressed his appetite for this kind of brutality time and again. Remember during the campaign, he suggested that he would order members of the military to kill the families of suspected terrorists. And when people pushed back, he said, well, they'll do what I tell them to do. His intervention in these cases is an indication that he does not understand the whole concept of war crimes or of military ethics. So once again, these stories are not one-offs. They're not gaffes. They reflect deeply seated beliefs. Cole, I was thinking about something you said last week when you said, all the warning lights are blinking red. When you hear this story, you realize that those warning signs were blinking red for the military even before the 2020 election. When you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff having these kinds of concerns, knowing what's going to happen, and in retrospect, many of us were alarmed, but we were not sufficiently alarmed. We did not know how radical Trump and his supporters would be, and how far they would go in trying to overturn the election. There's no excuse for not understanding the nature of the threat now. We've seen what he's capable of doing. We know what he's promising to do. So there's no ambiguity. There's no question mark like, what is Donald Trump capable of doing? What would he do as commander-in-chief? How would he use the military? What is his attitude toward the military? What is his attitude toward the Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power? We know all of this. So General Milley was ahead of the curve in being alarmed in 2020, but the situation is, if anything, even more dire.
I need to show all of you some more from this piece. Chairman Milley takes on the woke smears that Donald Trump and others on the right have lobbed at him, and it's pretty priceless. I have to sneak in a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have that and much more from this extraordinary brand new piece of reporting on General Milley. Plus, a lot has changed.